The Life of Dwight L. Moody. Chapter 8. The Civil War and the Christian Commission. I am going to join the Christian Association tomorrow night. Mr. Moody had written to his brother under date of April 19, 1854, immediately after leaving home for Boston. Then I shall have a place to go to when I want to go away anywhere, and I can have all the books I want to read free and only have to pay $1 a year. They have a large room, and the smart men of Boston lecture to them for nothing, and they get up a question box. These attractions and benefits of the Young Men's Christian Association were keenly appreciated by young Moody from the first. On his arrival in Chicago, he joined the association, which had recently been organized in that city as one of the results of the revival movement, and took an active interest in the noonday prayer meetings conducted under its aspects. After giving up business, he devoted much of his time to association work, with which he was closely identified at the beginning of the Civil War. In the days that followed the firing on Fort Sumter, Chicago, like all the other cities in the Union, felt the greatest excitement. Camp Douglas was formed near the southern limits of the city, and there recruits were massed and instructed. Among these new soldiers were a large number of Moody boys of the North Market Hall. A company was also raised among his friends and former associates in business, and on all sides he was urged into the service of his country. The cause of the Union appealed to him most strongly, for by all the traditions of his home and his New England training, he was an ardent abolitionist. During his stay in Boston, he listened frequently to the eloquence of such orators as William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Elijah P. Lovejoy. His uncle's boot and shoe store on Court Street was opposite the courthouse, and there he joined in the mob that attempted the liberation of Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave. On this occasion, the hot-headed youth of Boston were dispersed by the soldiers' musketry, but the event left an impression even greater than the eloquence of Faneuil Hall. Later, when an employee at Wistwall's boot and shoe store, the clerks from neighboring houses who met frequently Mr. Moody and his fellow salesmen constituted themselves into a lichem where the points of political differences between the North and South were warmly discussed by representatives of both sides. In spite of all this, he could not conscientiously enlist. There was never a time in my life when I felt that I could take a gun and shoot down a fellow being. In this respect, I am a Quaker, was his explanation. At the same time, he was alive to the opportunity for doing good offered by the military camps, and at once assisted in forming an Army and Navy committee of the Young Men's Christian Association, consisting of J.V. Farwell, B.F. Jacobs, and himself. Later, this work was affiliated with the Northwest branch of the Christian Commission. The first Christian work undertaken by the Commission consisted of services held among the soldiers that passed through Chicago. On the forming of Camp Douglas, a work was organized which resulted in the erection of a small temporal chapel, in which over 1,500 meetings were held. Edward W. Haley, who was among Mr. Moody's oldest associates in Christian work in Chicago, thus describes the beginning of the work. At one time, there were about 12,000 men there. Regiments were coming in and others going to the front all the time. The Young Men's Christian Association had a chapel for the use of the men, where frequent meetings were held. The western branch of the Christian Commission included among its members J.F. Farwell, B.F. Jacobs, Mr. Moody, and several others. We issued an Army hymn book with an American flag on the front page, and it was distributed freely among the soldiers. We visited the tents and barracks and found the men playing cards, and proposed to exchange our hymn books for the cards. The soldiers agreed quickly enough, indeed. So numerous were these exchanges that several of the Young Men Christian Association rooms were full of playing cards which the men had surrendered. This camp was finally struck, the men having all gone to the war. General Grant had captured Fort Donaldson and taken 10,000 Confederate prisoners, of whom about 9,000 were sent to Chicago and placed in Camp Douglas with a regiment of our men as guards. It was a period of popular apprehension, and the people of the city were very nervous. A week afterwards, at the close of the Union prayer meeting, Moody said to me, "Haley, Let us go down and hold a meeting there in the chapel with the prisoners. It was about 5 miles down to the camp, and as we got near the entrance, Moody said, "Haley, here is a ministerial pass. Take it. But how will you get in past the guard?" "In some way," was the confident reply. The guard passed me right in, but Moody was halted by fixed bayonets. "Stand back," came the stern order. "I am Moody, the president of the Young Men's Christian Association," he explained to the soldiers. "I don't care who you are. You can't get in here." At that moment, a captain who was passing stepped up and recognized the evangelist. To him, Moody appealed. "Let me in," he urged, "for the work's sake." The officer turned to the guard. "Let one of your men take Mr. Moody to headquarters. I will be responsible." We marched in, Moody under military guard. On the matter being explained at headquarters, the officer in charge said, "Well, seeing you are here and considering your object, you may stay, but don't repeat it. If you are not out of here at 8 p.m., you go into the guardhouse for the night." We went to the chapel, arranged things, and invited the men. It was soon packed full. Turning to me with a twinkle in his eye, Moody said, "Now, Haley, you preach." I remonstrated and said I wasn't a minister. "But you came in on a ministerial pass, and I didn't," he persisted. So I quietly acquiesced, and we had an interesting service. Mr. Moody took charge, and it seemed as though the Spirit of the Lord came down upon these men with great power. They came forward to the altar, 20, 30, 40 at a time. We closed the meeting and began inquiry work. Moody had the platform, and God used him wonderfully. The whole audience melted, and we saw strong men in tears. "God is here," Moody whispered to me. We looked at our watches. It was but a few seconds of 8, and we had to run to get out of camp, having no notion of passing a night in the guardhouse. These meetings we kept up 2 or 3 weeks, and many were converted. We formed a Young Men's Christian Association branch of the camp, and there were many kind expressions of gratitude, even from the higher officers, who were greatly pleased with the work. In a letter to his mother at the time, Moody wrote, "I am now at work among the soldiers a good deal. I had a good time in Kentucky. The boys wanted to have me become their chaplain, but my friends would not let me go, so I shall remain in the city. I would like to see you all and talk with you about my Savior, who seems so near to me. Oh, what would life be without Christ? I sometimes get to looking down on this world of sin, but when I look to Jesus, it makes me look up. My gospel services, prayer meetings, song services, distribution of Bibles, books and tracts, and by personal visitation, he tried to win the soldiers to Christ. He organized the Christians into bands of brothers who were to carry the banners of Christ with them and be loyal to one another and to the divine captain. The experiences gathered from this work constituted most effectual training for his later career as an evangelist. His sermons show many in evidence of the Christian commission work in the numerous illustrations drawn from his interviews with the soldiers. Even camp phraseology left a permanent influence upon his vocabulary, and in organizing large conventions and conducting evangelistic campaigns, he would call upon some workers to reinforce another, and would urge his associates to press the fight all along the line. The peculiar surroundings and impressive conditions under which the work was conducted made it necessary to urge his hearers to accept immediate salvation, and this was ever afterwards a conspicuous feature of his manner of address. With wounded men hovering between life and death, or with men on the march, resting in some place which they would have to leave the next day, it was, at least as far as he was concerned, the alternative of now or never. As he would not allow himself or them to be satisfied with never, he bent his whole energy to now. He was on the ground ministering to the wounded after the battles of Pittsburgh Landing, Shiloh, and Murfreesboro. He was with the army at Chattanooga and among the first to enter Richmond. It was after one of these battles that the following incident occurred, which Mr. Moody himself frequently related. We were taking a large number of wounded men down the Tennessee River after the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. A number of the young men of the Christian Commission were with me, and I told them that we must not let a man die on the boat that night without telling him of Christ in heaven. You know, the cry of a wounded man is, "Water, water." As we passed along from one to another, giving them water, we tried to tell them of the water of life, of which if they would drink, they would never die. He came to one of the men who had about as fine a face as I ever saw. I spoke to him, but he did not answer. I went to the doctor and said, "Doctor, do you think that man will recover?" "No, he lost so much blood before we got to him on the field that he fainted while we were amputating his leg. He will never recover. I said, I can't find out his name, and it seems a pity to let him die without knowing who he is. Don't you think we can bring him to? You may give him a little brandy and water, said the doctor. That will revive him if anything will. I sat down beside him and gave him brandy and water every now and then. While I was waiting, I said to a man nearby, do you know this man? Oh, yes, that is my chum. Has he a father or mother living? He has a widowed mother. Has he any brothers or sisters? 2 sisters, but he is the only son. What is his name? William Clark. I said to myself that I could not let him die without getting a message for that mother. Presently he opened his eyes, and I said, William, do you know where you are? He looked around a little dazed and said, oh, yes, I am on my way home to Mother. Yes, you are on your way home, I said, but the doctor says you won't reach your earthly home. I thought I'd like to ask you if you had any message for your mother. His face lighted up with an unearthly glow as he said, oh, yes, tell my mother that I died trusting in Jesus. It was the sweetest message I ever heard in my life. On returning to Chicago, Mr. Moody at once looked up the widowed mother and the 2 sisters and delivered the message from the dying soldier. As he was leaving the house, one of the sisters, only a child at the time, came to him and gave him the small savings of her sister and herself, with the request that he purchase a Bible to give to some soldier. When he went back to the front, Mr. Moody related this incident, asking who wanted that Bible. There was a number of petitions for it. Soon after, God called the children to join their brother, but not till their childish ministries had been used as a blessing to many soldiers. Another war incident that Mr. Moody frequently repeated occurred after the Battle of Murfreesboro. I was stationed in the hospital, he said. For 2 nights I had been unable to get rest, and being really worn out on the 3rd night, I had lain down to sleep. About midnight I was called to see a wounded soldier who was very low. At first I tried to put the messenger off, but he told me that if I waited till morning it might be too late. So I went to the ward where I had been directed and found the man who had sent for me. I shall never forget his face as I saw it that night in the dim, uncertain candlelight. I asked what I could do for him, and he said that he wanted me to help him to die. I told him I would bear him in my arms into the kingdom of God if I could, but I couldn't. Then I tried to preach the gospel. He only shook his head and said, he can't save me. I have sinned all my life. My thoughts went back to his loved ones in the north, and I thought that even then his mother might be praying for her boy. I repeated promise after promise and prayed with the dying man, but nothing I said seemed to help him. Then I said that I wanted to read to him an account of an interview that Christ had one night while here on earth, an interview with a man who was anxious about his eternal welfare. I read from the 3rd chapter of John how Nicodemus came to the Master. As I read, his eyes became riveted upon me, and he seemed to drink in every syllable. When I came to the words, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. He stopped me and asked, is that there? Yes, I said. Well, he said, I never knew that was in the Bible. Read it again. Leaning on his elbow on the side of the cot, he brought his hands together tightly, and when I finished, he exclaimed, that's good. Won't you read it again? Slowly I repeated the passage the 3rd time. When I finished, I saw his eyes were closed, and the troubled expression of his face had given way to a peaceful smile. His lips moved, and I bent over him to catch what he was saying, and heard in a faint whisper, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. He opened his eyes and said, that's enough, don't read any more. Early next morning I again came to his cot, but it was empty. The attendant in charge told me that the young man had died peacefully, and said that after my visit he had rested quietly, repeating to himself now and then that glorious proclamation, whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. The following description of one of the journeys Mr. Moody took to the scene of battle is sent by a friend. During the winter and spring of 1861 and 1862, I was a medical student in the city of Chicago, and saw Mr. Moody almost every day as he went hurryingly about, busily engaged in his good work. That was in the early days of the Young Men's Christian Association, and he was looked upon as one of the most active promoters of that association. The great battle of Pittsburgh Landing was fought on Sunday, and Monday, the 6th and 7th of April, 1862. The news reached Chicago on Tuesday, the 8th, and on Wednesday morning a call came for physicians and nurses for the wounded, for the supply of both was entirely inadequate for the work to be done. Accordingly, the Young Men's Christian Association was called upon to send as many nurses as possible, and I, being a medical student, was invited to be one of the company. A special train was made up by the Illinois Central Railroad Company, and by 5 or 6 o'clock Wednesday evening, we were at the depot ready to be off. Our train was a heavy one, carrying about 60 or 75 physicians and about 300 nurses, besides many supplies. I had a seat in the center of the car, which was comfortably full. When we were 2 or 3 hours out of Chicago and everyone was getting settled down in his seat for the night, we had no sleepers then, I was aroused by a gentle tap on the shoulder and asked if I would not attend Mr. Moody's prayer meeting, which was then to be held in the front of the car. I wasn't a Christian then, and I didn't go, but nevertheless my conscience gave me a stinging rebuke, and I was set to thinking. In the forward end of the car was Mr. Moody, engaged in conducting a prayer meeting. In the rear end was a company of men playing a game of cards. I couldn't help realizing the wonderful zeal of the man in his great work, and how earnest and how careful he was that no duty be neglected, no opportunity lost. We reached CAIRO on Thursday, April 10th, were transferred from our train to the steamer, and soon on our way up the Ohio and Tennessee rivers. When evening came, the passengers were sitting about in groups in the large cabin. Mr. Moody, with his Young Men Christian Association assistants, passed through the crowd and again invited the men to attend prayers in one corner of the large room. There again he conducted a service. I don't remember seeing anything more of the card players, as on the first evening, so on the next. I didn't attend prayer, but I remember that among those who didn't, there was no effort made to disturb the meeting, nor was any evidence of disrespect shown as far as I could see. On Friday afternoon, about 3 o'clock, we reached Pittsburgh Landing, and were at once sent to the different steamers that were standing there, loaded with hundreds of wounded soldiers waiting for our arrival, and so were scattered in all directions. I saw no more of Mr. Moody during that trip, but have thought of this circumstance many, many times, and of the intense Christian zeal by which he was always impelled. Many an incident is related of Mr. Moody's enthusiastic admiration of heroism, and this was, of course, actuated when there was the added quality of outspoken loyalty to Christ. Such a soldier Mr. Moody recognized in Major Whittle, who was then a lieutenant in the 72nd Illinois. After the Battle of Vicksburg in 1863, this young officer was sent home severely wounded. His popularity in the city called forth a great demonstration in Chicago on his return. The American Express Company, in whose service he had been engaged, sent their employees with a band of music and all their wagons to escort him from the station. A few days later, Lieutenant Whittle was asked to make a speech at a patriotic rally where a number of prominent men had been invited to speak. Referring to this occasion, Mr. Whittle said, I, a boy of 21, was put forward to speak, with Bishop Simpson on the platform behind waiting to give his address. I was weak from my wounds and felt foolish at being in such a position. Directly in front of me in the center of the hall, a sturdy young man jumped to his feet and cried, Give him 3 cheers. I recognized the face of Mr. Moody as he led the cheering with great earnestness. This manifestation of sympathy nerved me for the few words that followed, and I have often thought it was a specimen of what his courage, faith, and example have been to me all through his life. When I told him sometime afterwards of how much good his sympathy had done me that night, and how vividly I remember his earnest, determined look as he led the crowd, I was rewarded by his reply. I took you into my heart that night, and you have been there ever since. While serving with the command of General O. Howard, who was in thorough sympathy with his efforts, Mr. Moody's ministry was especially fruitful. General Howard thus speaks of his work in the Army. Moody and I met for the first time in Cleveland, East Tennessee. It was about the middle of April, 1864. I was bringing together my 4th Army Corps. 2 divisions had already arrived, and there encamped in and near the village. Moody was then fresh and hearty, full of enthusiasm for the Master's work. Our soldiers were just about to set out on what we all felt promised to be a hard and bloody campaign, and I think we were especially desirous of strong preaching. Crowds and crowds turned out to hear us. He showed them how a soldier could give his heart to God, how preaching was direct and effective, and multitudes responded with a promise to follow Christ. These wartime experiences introduced Mr. Moody to a larger field by bringing him prominently before the whole country. The Young Men's Christian Association noon prayer meetings in Chicago became a center where he and his fellow workers met and reported on their frequent excursions to the front, and people from all over the Northwest sent in requests for prayer at these meetings on behalf of husbands, brothers, and sons. When the Spanish War broke out and thousands of young men were again gathered into army camps, Mr. Moody's heart went out towards them with the same longing that had urged him on during the Civil War. His experiences in 1861 through 65 helped him to arouse the churches in this new emergency. He became chairman of the Evangelical Department of the Army and Navy Christian Commission, whose method of work was fourfold. 1. The preaching of the gospel by well-known ministers and evangelists to whom the men would listen. 2. The placing of Young Men's Christian Association tents within reach of every regiment, whether the men might go as a place of resort, and where they would find good reading and writing materials. 3. The free distribution of Bibles, Testaments, hymn books, and other religious books. And 4. The visitation of the sick and wounded in hospitals. The following letter, which he wrote at that time, resulted in great blessing to thousands of soldiers in the great military camps during the summer of 1898. 30 years ago, war clouds gathered over our land, and the Church of God was aroused, as I have never seen it since, in behalf of the young men of America. This interest expressed itself in the formation of the Christian Commission, and everywhere efforts were made for the religious interests of the soldiers. Meetings were held everywhere, and many a camp became the scene of a deep and effective revival. And for more than 30 years I have been continually meeting men who were converted in those army meetings. Now the dark shadow of war again rests upon our land. It is not possible that God intends to use even the darkest of this evil for the blessing of the youth of this land. And while he has called us to become the instruments of his justice, may he not have in store a season of revival for those who, brought face to face with danger and a realization of the seriousness of life, may be reached when at other times careless and indifferent. It seems to me that it is just the nick of time in which to reach thousands of young men with the gospel, either through a testament, a good book, or the spoken word. A minister in Philadelphia writes me that there is an excellent opportunity of doing good at Tampa, and I have no doubt that other camps offer equally favorable conditions. Mr. Moody was preaching in Pittsburgh when one of the first regiments started for Cuba. He mentioned that incident at the meeting and raised several $100s in order to follow these young soldiers with the gospel. Major Riddle, Dr. A.C. Dickens, Reverend R.A. Torrey, and others were sent. An appeal was made for money to send books as well as men. The Young Men's Christian Association also desired to send workers to the front, and the War Department, deciding that it could have only one religious body among the soldiers, an Army-Navy Christian Commission was organized, and Mr. Moody was made chairman of the Evangelistic Department. The object of the organization was to reach the soldiers and sailors of the United States in the Army and Navy with the gospel of Christ. Bibles, religious books, colportage, library books, and the new Army hymn book, compiled by Mr. Sankey, were sent in great quantities. Major Whittle gave this incident among many, showing the very important nature of the work done through this agency. I call on a dying lieutenant this morning who said that he was turned to God at the first meeting held at the camp. I did not know about it at the time, but my heart was full of gratitude to God as the dying man's face lit up in recognition of me. His hot hand pressed mine as he drank in, "He that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out," and other scriptural passages. He told me that he did in his heart trust God. We sang to him, "My faith looketh up to thee," and commended him to God in prayer. He has a wife and 5 children. He was a traveling man, and unsaved up to the night of May 27th. The doctor said that there was no help and that he would die today. If God has been pleased to use my coming here to save that one soul, I will praise him through eternity. Another incident is given herewith. We spend our forenoons going to the hospitals. There are about 1,000 men at Chickamauga in the various hospitals, sick with malaria, fever, and typhoid fever, and every day brings us to the bedside of some hungry, thirsty, dying soldier. One of our workers went to a hospital and asked, "May I go in and see the sick? Is there anything I can do?" "For God's sake, yes," said the surgeon. "Go with that woman. She has just arrived from the north, and I can't bear to tell her that her boy won't recognize her. He is dying. He won't live 5 minutes. Go in with her." So he went in and stood by the cot where the soldier was breathing his last. He couldn't recognize his mother, and this mother, a lady dressed in black, stood there by the foot of the cot, watching the last breath of her dying boy. And when at last his soul had gone, she turned back the sheet that covered him, and there upon his army shirt was a badge of the Epworth League. He had had it transferred from his soldier's coat to his shirt. He told the nurse he wanted to wear that badge when he was dying. As his mother looked upon it, she burst into a sob, and the whole tent of 6 soldiers, and the doctors and nurses sobbed with her. And what a privilege it was for our delegate to tell that mother, "I was here yesterday and talked to your boy. I had been speaking with this man here about being a Christian, and your son overheard it. And when I came to his side, he said, 'Oh, dear me, how can that man get along without Jesus?' I said to him, 'Are you a Christian?' And with a smile upon his young face, he said, 'You bet I am.' And he turned back the sheet and showed me the badge upon his breast, and I talked with him and prayed with him.